Today, we're going to talk about the influence of war on Hartman's thoughts and why it matters today. And this is insights from the newly published book of Hartman's work, edited by Cliff Hurst from Georgia. And the cover design, consultations on editing, layout, and content design were done by Catherine Blakemore from Utah. And quick little bios about them, and then I'm going to hand it over to them to do the book giveaway and go into their presentation. Cliff is a professor, researcher, and consultant. He holds a PhD in human and organizational systems, and he did his dissertation on axiological hermeneutics. I had to phonetically list that out, but I think I said it right. Axiological hermeneutics, that was his dissertation. He is our VP of research. He's a wonderful man and human. He's on the board, and we just appreciate him so much. Catherine is a brand strategist, and she resolves business problems using design thinking. She has a BA in communication and holds a master's degree of strategic communication from Westminster College. She is the vice president of membership on the board. Take it away, Cliff and Catherine.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to be here with you and start us off with some giveaways of the book that we're going to be talking about. So I know I'm probably inverted and it's flipped, but this is the book. This is the paperback version. Well, actually, Cliff, do you have a hardback version with you?
I've given them all away.
Oh, awesome. Well, we also have the hardback version of this, which is what we'll be giving away. So the two quick giveaways, again, just following the same structure that Susie implemented earlier, just type in that you're the winner. But so who's got the birthday closest to September 19th? That day in 1943 was when chapter 2, How to Win the Peace, was written from this book. So who's got a birthday closest to September 19th? Fernanda does. Yay! Oh, wait. September 8th, too. September, what date are you, Fernanda? Type it in the chat. So I think we've got a September 17th. And then with that,
September 15th.
Oh, 15. Oh, it looks like 17's closer. So Renee, it looks like you are the winner for this.
Hey, Renee! Renee from Club International. Woohoo! Go Renee!
and then we have got also the birthday closest to February 24th. It was that day in 1943 when the chapter in War as in Peace, Teamwork was written. So who's got a birthday closest to February 24th? Anybody?
Chris Deary. Chris Deary's he's got it private by mistake, but his Chris, make it to everyone. And the
February 24th, my birthday.
February 24th. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are so excited to get started. There's so much dialogue that we want to have about this book and with you guys about Hartman's words and his thinking. But just a brief introduction to this book as it relates to my own personal story, someone who is not actually practicing with the Hartman value profile in my day-to-day life, but just a huge fan of Hartman's thinking and Hartman's worldview. This book was absolutely astounding to me. I picked it up and I was like, Cliff, I mean, it's on War and Peace. How relevant is this going to be for like right now? And turns out it is beyond relevant. I actually read this book in full on a road trip with my dad. And so he was driving and I was reading, and we spent 6 hours reading through this book. And my dad was just astounded at how relevant and how profound so much of Hartman's thinking was. So I'm just really excited to share that with you guys, encourage you guys to buy the book, and then just sort of dive into some of the implications of what this book means for today. So what you're going to get from this Q&A between Cliff and I, me as sort of the cover designer and just someone involved in the publishing process, and Cliff as the editor who's so deeply entrenched in the words of Hartman, especially in this book and all his other works. But what you're going to get from this Q&A is just sort of a moral mirror to look into with regards to war and peace in today's world, and in our daily life, and how it's not this broad ethereal concept, but it actually relates to our actions and our daily interactions with people and with the world. You'll also get an understanding of how well regarded and involved Hartman was in the field of international relations in his time, much to, I think, some of the surprise of many people as they read his work. And then a picture of what a morality focused on people really, really looks like. So toss it off to you, Cliff, to give a little context for how this book even came to being.
Sure, be glad to do that. First of all, I want everyone to know that I did not set out to publish a book on Hartman's thoughts on war and peace. In 2017, Jay Morris reported at the annual conference that he had discovered a manuscript in the archives. It's called On God's Side, and he gave a brief overview of it, and I got really excited. I said, we need to capture that. We need to bring it into print. And by good fortune, that next summer, I was able to apply for and received a small research grant from my college that allowed me to bring 2 undergraduate students with me to the archives at the University of Tennessee. And we spent 10 days pouring through everything we could, over 100,000 pages of unpublished manuscripts, looking for what might be presentable of Hartman's work to bring into print. And over the next 6 months or so, I printed page by page and started looking at it and clumping it into categories. And I kept coming back to Hartman's writings on war and peace. And I was surprised to see such a continuity of thought, such a continuity of attention by him to this. And I thought, well, maybe this is something we ought to do. And I got more and more excited about it. And then I happened to turn to the book, Forms of Value and Valuation. And there was a quote there, the first chapter in Forms of Value and Valuation is by Rita Hartman, who was by then his widow. And she wrote this. She said, Bob was dreaming of a world of peace. Hitler's horrendous crimes colored his whole thinking, and he hoped to be influential in seeing to it that such a nightmare would never happen again. His theory of value was his answer to the challenge of a horror which only ended with the victory of the Allies over Germany. Hopefully, the theory of value contributes to the aim that it could never happen again. And I thought, wow, that's profound. And like many of the rest of you, I believe I had been focusing most of my attention on the HVP, not a broader picture. So I just became enamored of the depth and the breadth of Hartman's work, and I hope you will too. So if this presentation is successful, you'll be prompted to go out and buy it, read it, and tell others about it. And I hope it helps to expand your understanding of Hartman's work beyond just the assessment instrument he's known for. I hope it would help you find new and creative ways to make the world a better place, because that is the mission of the Institute. I do believe that somehow together we can all do what we should do to prevent a nuclear war. Our attention is diverted to COVID-19 right now, but the possibility of a nuclear conflagration is greater than it was in Hartman's time. And this is a controversial book. You'll hear some of the controversy in what we talk about today. And I hope to trigger more thought, more dialogue, more commentary. Please think about commenting, critiquing it, or expanding some of the holes in Hartman's thought here. You can do that in our Journal of Formal Axiology that I'm the editor of, or we could also do that through the blogs. If you're more of an informal writer, let's dialogue about what we're learning about Hartman's thought.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And I think that goes into Cliff and I's hope for this session and really diving into this work with you guys. And we would love to just solicit questions. Unlike the way we've been structuring questions in the previous presentations, if we see them in the chat, we want to dialogue about those the second they come in. So we do have some preset questions we'll be going with, but any questions that come to mind as we're talking about any of these things, and if it's something that we can address from Hartman's work or from our experience with the book, we'd love to do that. So to kick us off, Cliff, this book, we've talked a lot about how Hartman's life was marked by war in a variety of different capacities. And I think exactly what you just said about the nuclear destruction, this was the first step towards a sort of a new worldview with regard to that. So just thinking about all of that, in this book, Hartman alluded to his experience in Germany, of course, in Nazi Germany before he escaped. And he talked about the effects of passivity and global inertia and some of these other big concepts throughout a bunch of different chapters. But just tell us a little bit about his experience in Germany and kind of what this means when his life was marked by war.
Sure. And we put the book together in chronological order, in the order in which these manuscripts seem to have been written. Some of it was guesswork. But I became intrigued by a chapter in the book that we've entitled How to Win the Peace. And it was a proposal submitted by Hartman to Representative Saul Bloom, who is the chair of the House Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee from 1938 to 1949. Look at what crucial years those were in American history. The lead up to and the conduct of World War II and the immediate aftermath. Saul Bloom was the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And what intrigues me is Hartman said he submitted this at the request of Saul Bloom. And I don't know how to answer this, but I'm curious, how did someone who had immigrated to the United States less than a year and a half earlier, he was a high school teacher at Lake Forest Academy in Chicago. He was teaching Spanish to high school students. How was he someone that the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee solicited insight from? Somehow he must have been known from his work in Germany or England or in Sweden and Mexico that led up to this. I don't know. But in his proposal to the House, he begins it with a reflection on how Hitler came to power. And we have to remember Hitler didn't seize power, he was elected. And the war began because a lot of other people in the world said, well, that's not in my backyard, so I won't worry about it. So this is what Hartman wrote to Saul Bloom. The evil that arose in this man Hitler was neither recognized nor stopped. His success is due to a universal ignorance of the conditions of peace, a global inertia. Now this is a collective mea culpa, we did not possess the consciousness of evil, let alone the will and power to crush it. We had no standard of good and evil in spite of all our knowledge and philosophy. Ours was a time without dignity and without conscience. Through ignorance and inertia, we lost the peace. Through ignorance and inertia, we would lose the next one, and therewith perhaps our national freedom forever. The next peace must be won. It cannot merely be maintained. I'm moved by that.
Yeah, those words just, I mean, I remember the first time I read them and then thinking back through them and then rereading them. And it's such a call to action, I think, for our daily life. So, if Hartman were, here with us, what do you think he would, I mean, it's positing, but what do you think our daily life can change or look like to avoid this sort of passivity and this inertia?
Well, the rest of that chapter outlined a proposal that's very similar to what came out of the mid-1940s. When the U.S. first thought, we're going to win the war, let's plan on how to maintain the peace or to win the peace. And that is the development of the United Nations, the development of the Marshall Plan. How do we turn former enemies into friends? Because you don't go to war with countries that are friends. And I think that's a prescription that we could look at today.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned that you put this book together chronologically, which I think is really interesting. So we see in chapter 2, like you mentioned, this letter solicited to Saul Bloom. And then in chapter 3, we see kind of this distinct departure from traditional sort of writing and what we expect with philosophical and ethical writing by using like metaphor and some of these other rhetorical strategies. Can you tell us a bit about that chapter and what it says?
Sure. The chapter 3 in the book is a chapter from the unpublished manuscript On God's Side. Now that manuscript, by the way, is 850 pages. We plan to publish it someday, but it's a huge undertaking. And there's probably not a lot of people who would buy and pay for a book 850 pages long, but I've only studied half of it, looked at the whole of it, but I'm so fascinated by the way Hartman expresses himself there. It's metaphorical, it's intrinsic. I mean, if you're like me and you tried reading The Structure of Value, you got a lot of good night's sleep because it puts you to sleep right away. The Structure of Value is hard to read. The Knowledge of Good is a wonderful philosophical text, but it too is hard to read because they are analytical and logical, and that was Hartman's forte. But this book, On God's Side, is metaphorical. And I inserted in here an edited version called The Triumph of Gravitation. And gravity itself is a metaphor Hartman uses throughout the revolution against war. He says war is like gravity, it is the great leveler. War levels trees and buildings and cities. It levels bridges. Men fighting in a war dig foxholes in which they live and they die clinging to the mud. And I mean, there's some horribly strong metaphors about this gravity as a force of leveling, of reducing humanity to a level plane. It's the physical law of entropy. He then contrast that to the law of life, or the law of complexity, to the law of I think what scientists today call autopoiesis, and that is the tendency for peace to bring life in vibrancy and development. So this metaphor is a powerful one to distinguish war from peace, and it's all in this book. And that's one of probably 24 metaphors that he gains. So I just thought that the readers of The Revolution Against War ought to get a taste of a different style of Hartman. And that different style comes from On God's Side, in the chapter called The Triumph of Gravitation. It begins like this. Now, that book is a dialogue between Hartman and his deceased father, who had died about 10 years earlier. It begins, "Dear Father, this is my second war. When you were in the first, I was just a little boy, 8 years old when you returned with a bullet hole through your helmet." Hartman was 4 years old when his father went to fight in World War I. He was 8 years old when you saw him again. He goes on to say that he asked his dad, "Dad, Father, when are you going back to fight?" And he said, "I won't, because the war is over." And Hartman said, "Well, if there's no war, what is there?" He said, "All he'd known is war." And his father said, "Peace." And he said, "Peace, what is that?" And then they ruminate on what it means to have peace. It's a pretty powerful chapter. I hope you read it with that in mind.
Yeah, I remember reading through that and reading that ironically to my dad, as I'm on this road trip. And it was so powerful, the language that he used. And I think, we've had some discussion here today on readability. And I think Sherry Smith sort of mentioned with Freedom to Live. And I think this book is so readable that I was quite literally able to read it out loud while on this road trip. I mean, it's so dynamic, it's so engaging. And that chapter in particular was just really, really powerful. But one of the chapters for me that was astounding, I mean, I had to catch myself and pause as I was reading it, was the Hartman's 1946 report from Europe after World War II. That was, just a shocking chapter in so many ways, both emotionally and I think in the way it's written, it's just so personal. But can you share a bit of the core essence of that report with us? Because I do think, obviously we encourage you all to buy the book and read it for yourself, but that chapter, that core essence is so critical for, I believe, daily life today.
Sure. And I had not known this from other studies of Hartman, but he returned to Europe in 1946, the year after the war ended. I believe he returned on a trip sponsored by some sort of a council of Christian churches. Whether he went by himself under their sponsorship or went as a group, I don't know. But when he returned, he gave 2 reports to them. And this one was called Report from Europe. I believe it was given as a presentation. So I think what we found in the archives were presentation notes. It reads as if it's a speech. To me, what he came upon here and voiced for maybe the first time in what I've studied is the power of the intrinsic. So I quote Hartman. "I learned also that the economic and political problems with which we are so much concerned are trivial as compared with the problems of the human soul with which we are so little concerned. War and peace, I now know, are not problems of politics or economics or geography or bureaucracy. Rather, they are problems of the human heart."
Man, if that's not a call to action, I don't know what is.
Yeah, he goes on to give many stories of survivors of the Holocaust he met, particularly in Sweden. He applauded Sweden's willingness to take them in and the incredible turnaround in their lives from the most dire circumstances, told in a brutally candid way about what they are able to do by coming back to life.
Yeah, I think the message of hope in that chapter, both of what he heard from survivors of the Holocaust, but also what I viewed as sort of his engagement with those conversations and those thoughts. I mean, it is a message of hope, but it is also a message with a distinct call to action about these problems of the human heart. And I think that that's a beautiful thing for us to be thinking about in day-to-day life is, from consultants to professors to whatever you do. This is something that when you think about this and bring this to the forefront, I think it's really the heart of what Hartman was getting at with this. Yeah, so we have just a couple notes in the chat. Looks like Jay mentioned that On God's Side, Hartman talks about moving beyond the senses, sort of this cognitive to the spiritual. And this is the reason why his words speak so clearly today. And I think, I couldn't agree with that more, Jay, just in bringing together how it might not feel like it's relevant. I mean, this was written in 1946. What does he know about Facebook, Instagram, and social media, and social activism in today's age? But it is so relevant because it's so truthful and it's so core. Just some other, just beautiful. Wow, my mind is blown. That's amazing. It's a call for awareness. I think I agree, Merritt. I really do. So we see, Cliff in this writing and thinking that he has this immense concern for the heart of people, but also this balance between the technological development he saw then and sort of moral development that he saw a need for. Can you elaborate a bit on that balance and talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'll elaborate, and I'd like to quote something from Hartman too. But one of the things that struck me so as I was putting this book together is how openly and freely Hartman writes about issues of morals, morality, and spirituality. I think as an institute, and I don't know if I'm speaking for others, but I'll speak for myself and assume I'm speaking for others, the dialogue so far today would illustrate that. We tend to think of cognitions, of thought patterns, of judgment, of decision making, of the structure of values. Are we dodging the more important issue here, which is morality and morals? Are we not free to talk about that even amongst ourselves now? And should we be? Because Hartman is setting an example here in this book that we ought to. This tension between humankind's technological development and our lack of spiritual development is throughout all of Hartman's writing. And in chapter 6 of this book is called The Challenge of Peace. This is a well-received document because he gave it twice as convocations at college graduations, and he also had it published twice. And just a quote from that: "What happened to the Germans can happen to any nation. It is likely to happen if technological societies do not muster their moral energies. And it is, as it is, our moral and social life lacks intelligent organization. Between the good of tomorrow and the evil of today stands the ignorance of man about himself." To me, this is a call to the intrinsic, and it's a call to the self side of those of us who use the Hartman value profile. It's a vital part of our own development. And he brings it out in the context of war and peace.
I think we're seeing that here in the chat as well. Just a note from Eddie Corbel: "Formal axiology provides a secular platform to increase awareness about morality." And then just some echoes of I over E over S. Yes, yes, more on intrinsic. Susie quoting again that man's ignorance about himself, which I think again is powerful. And you'll see that you'll see that quote pulled in another publication we'll be talking about at the end of this session. And then Jay just mentioning this man had the foresight to know that the machines could win if we lose our souls. And I think, that's something for us to be thinking about in today's world with how technologically driven. I mean, we're here right now using technology, but how technologically driven we are we matching that? Just as a thought exercise that hopefully turns into a practice. So we see like an overarching theme behind his writings is this pressing need for love, compassion, and action in our societies, both then and now. And he talks about in his societies was both Germany and the U.S. And he talks broadly about his societies. So what do you think he would personally advise us to do? What does this focus on love, compassion, action look like?
Well, here's an interesting proposal he made, and this is just a manuscript we found. I don't know who it was submitted to, if it was ever. It's written sort of along the lines of that proposal to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Saul Bloom was dead by this time. It was probably written in the early 1950s, but the headline is called The Secretary of Peace. And to me, this is Hartman's first foray. Now, his thoughts were changing as the 20th century moved on. During World War II, he was adamant that the US and the Allies must achieve an absolute and total military victory over Germany and Japan, and then occupy those territories until their society could be rebuilt and they could have democratic institutions, and then they could join the United Nations and so forth. But that starting point in the mid-1940s for Hartman was, we need a total military victory. Then the atomic bomb was dropped, and that changed his mind dramatically. He began to realize that war is no longer a solution, because war equals destruction of humankind. So he said, we've got to figure out some other way. But this was and still is a very radical idea. It's the first expression of his call for an end to sovereignty as a solution to world wars. But he was tiptoeing into that subject here. In chapter 9, the Revolution Against War, he gets very specific about it. But here he's tiptoeing. He's not saying we need to do away with the US military or national sovereignty or a Department of Defense, but he says we ought to have a new cabinet level person called the Secretary of Peace to kind of bring a counterbalance to that thinking. But this is a section of that chapter called The Secretary of Peace, written obviously during the years of the Korean War. It's undated. We are today engaged in a Cold War with Russia and a hot war with China. We are acting and being acted upon as nations have since the beginning of history, namely as organizations of physical power. The policies he's about to refer to are policies of national defense, at that time becoming known as mutual assured destruction or second strike capability and so forth. He says there is no reason why this policy should not lead where such policy has always led, namely to total war. Just as little as one can learn by being lazy, lose weight by overeating, stay sober by drinking, to be happy by suffering, say truth by lying, or survive by committing suicide, in a word, achieve an end by doing its opposite, as little can one bring about peace by arming for war. What is bad in all these distortions is the fiction of the nation as a collective reality and the neglect of the individual, the collectivistic fallacy. At the basis of it is mechanistic thinking in terms of physical power, which regards nations not as people, but as power machines to be manipulated by social, political, and military engineers. This is the thinking of the leaders in the nation states, no matter whether these states are communistic, socialistic, republican, democratic, or monarchistic. It is a disease of sovereignty. It brings it about that a mild and innocuous little man from Kansas City, who would never dream of even hurting the hair on the head of a Cocker Spaniel, orders as one of his first acts of office, after becoming president of a large country, the incineration and a blast of fire of 80,000 men, women, and children. Without any qualms of conscience, you and I probably would have done the same. Leading a nation, we lose the reality of people. We flatten out the people of the world in collectivistic terms. Instead of the home of the free, the land of the brave, the shelter of the poor, the opportunity for the rich, this place where love and compassion moves human hearts, we see the world as a mechanical body inhabited by power constellations. He's elaborating on that theme of the distance between the gravitation of war, the flattening out of humankind, and the opportunity to be richer and more fully alive by focusing on the individual. This is the first expression. Now, the funny thing to me is, in this book, Hartman never uses the word axiology. But you can see preludes to it. You can see how he's leading to this theory throughout his writing about war and peace.
One of the things you brought up, Cliff, at the beginning of one of those quotes was when Hartman alluded to sort of this mutually assured destruction. We actually have a note here from Mark Moore, who worked with Robert Hartman on the draft and had him deliver his paper to the entire University of Tennessee. Bob and Mark most discussed the policy of mutually assured destruction. He's curious how you feel about this policy today, as it has worked quite well. But Robert Hartman hated the mutually assured destruction. I'm assuming the concept of it.
Yeah. I've started reading, as I study this book, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, who keep what they call the doomsday clock, which is an annual update on how close is the world to a nuclear war. I was just reading I just forgot, Bob, a book called Rage, which was an insight into the Trump administration. And he interviewed James Mattis, who reveals in this book how perilously close we were to a nuclear war with North Korea in the fall of 2017. Most of us weren't paying attention to it, but it was close to the brink. That was the book by Bob Woodward. So I might differ with you, Mark, in that I would say so far we're lucky. But when Hartman wrote in the time of the Cold War, there were only 2 nuclear nations. Today, there are at least 11 countries that have nuclear weapons and the power to shoot them off to foreign countries. I think we're at greater risk than ever.
Yeah, I think, Cliff, if I could actually quote you, we've spent a lot of time quoting Hartman here, but I'd love to quote you from, I believe it's the preface of the book. You mentioned the 2020 Doomsday Clock statement of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. So the organization was founded in 1945, Cliff's words, by scientists from the University of Chicago who had helped develop the first atomic weapons during the Manhattan Project. In their annual report, published each year since 1947, the bulletin announces the board's decision to move forward or backward the time of the doomsday clock. Borrowing the metaphor of a 2-minute warning from American football, they write, "The last 2 minutes bring newfound vigilance and focus to participants and viewers alike. Every second matters." Accordingly, in 2020, the world has entered into the realm of the 2-minute warning, a period where the danger is high and the margin of error low. Those are the words from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. The 2020 Bulletin warns us that the world is sleepwalking its way through a new, unstable nuclear landscape. The arms control boundaries that have helped prevent nuclear catastrophe for the last half-century are being steadily dismantled. And again, that's from the preface of the book, but quoted also from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And I think that is a profound heaviness, but also an opportunity to read Hartman's work here.
Yes, I think I mentioned at the beginning, this is a controversial book, and Hartman's recommendations are controversial. Perhaps my personal embrace of them are controversial, but we need to engage with it. We can't just put our head in the sand. So I would welcome critique and commentary of this book, either as part of the journal or as part of our blog on the Hartman. I think we ought to engage with these matters.
I think you're dead right with this, Cliff, because I think what we see from how you've put these chapters together is that these weren't isolated writings sitting dormant in an office. These were preparation for speeches. These were, as Mark said, this was something being presented. So I think Hartman was encouraging, at least to my understanding, a dialogue regarding these elements. So I think as stewards of his work, it's our responsibility to further engage that dialogue. Here it looks like we've got some readings here. I see from Susie, I love knowing this history. Art's just a thank you to us for bringing this book to print. Thank you, Art, for reading it. Susie, will we be depressed from reading this book or hopeful? Funny enough, I'm actually going to take an answer to that, Cliff, because my dad was gently horrified at Hartman's absolutely astounding, consistent optimism and hope. So I would say, no, you will not be depressed from reading this book. I did not feel discouraged at any point in time from reading this book. In fact, I felt more encouraged than ever to engage in this dialogue. And, if my dad on this road trip, I'm reading this and he's just scoffing and going, man, this guy's a hopeful guy, just if that, I think that we get a really clear picture of that this was a dialogue to engage with, not necessarily just a heavy warning. Cliff, do you have anything else to add on that? We've got some other notes coming in the chat.
Sure. I turned to the last paragraphs of the first chapter in the book, which is called In Wars and Peace Teamwork. And it was written, I believe, in 1942. And it's a little lengthy, but maybe I can quote a bit of it. Thus, it is up to us to make the world a better place to live after this war. If we understand that to the global science of this age belongs a global power of compassion, that the power of technology today has to be matched by the power of religious consciousness, then we have grasped the secret of this time and age. Then among us there will arise the great leader of the new age, a leader not toward new battles, nor toward new scientific discoveries, toward new meanings of harnessing the physical nature of man or the universe, but a leader towards discoveries of the soul, toward the discovery of these spiritual energies, which are more powerful, more gigantic, more devastating, and more blissful than any physical or scientific power. Then we shall be able to harness the powers of human nature and liberate man, turning passion into compassion, science into conscience, and fulfilling the prophecy of the scriptures, that after the days of tribulation will come an age of the Spirit. Perhaps it is our generation that shall not pass till all of these things be done. Perhaps it is our generation that is to lead mankind, strong in mind and strong in soul, on the road to peace. The peace of the prophet and the Christian, mindful of evil, guarding the well-being of his fellow man, and ever prepared to combat any force that touches his body, mind, or soul.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't throw our timing off. I hadn't planned on reading that one, Catherine, but it
Oh
came
no,
to me.
we're good. The chat's going off, so I just want to make sure we're getting to that. From Robert Calabrese, he's thinking this might be a great topic for our Institute happy hour discussion. So stay tuned for something like that. Some gratitude that we're doing this so very timely. Just some thanks for the publication of this, and a note that John will pay for the entire 850-page book of On God's Side. So we've got at least one buyer out there. Sounds fun. And we've got a note here from Eddie Corbel, and I don't know that, Cliff, you'll hopefully know the answer to this, but he says, I know that Hartman was influenced by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, Logotherapy, and Maslow with Hierarchy of Need, but was curious if he was also influenced by the work of Pitirim Sorokin. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. The following quote by Sorokin provides some parallels to our discussion. Quote, we are living, thinking, and acting at the darkest hour of this transitory night, with its nightmares, gigantic destruction, and heart-rending horrors. If mankind can avoid the irretrievable catastrophe of greater world wars, the dawn of a new magnificent order in the human universe is waiting to meet the coming generations. Again, from Sorokin, 1957, in Social and Cultural Dynamics.
I know that he knew and communicated with Pitirim Sorokin quite a bit. There's some correspondence in the archives between them and about Sorokin. I forget the organization. Maybe it was their involvement with this Humanistic Psychology Association. Maybe it was the founding of one of those centers for ethics that Hartman tried so hard to get going. But I remember seeing correspondence with Pitirim and about him in there. And if I'm not mistaken, someone who may have it nearby, in the book, The Critique of War, edited by Allen Ginsberg, in which Hartman's chapter, the Revolution Against War, appeared, I believe Sorokin had a chapter in that book as well.
Yeah, it looks like a note from Sky Hurst. Sorokin started the first department of sociology at Harvard, so maybe that was where the communication was happening there, Cliff. Just some other compliments for you, Cliff, in the chat. Nancy Roberts could listen to your voice all day. Susie agrees. You're so in the flow on this. It's another note from Sky Hurst, just a note that Hartman talks about the power of the intrinsic, a place where we are deeply in need. a note from Christopher Coleman that you, Cliff, demonstrate godliness and goodness. And then a note from Vera, it used to be war and peace. Now it's definitely life or death. Any thoughts on that stuff, Cliff?
Yeah, I would say Vera's conclusion was Hartman's conclusion. And in fact, the last chapter in this book is an outline of a book that Hartman was writing when he died. I believe it was to be called The Revolution Against War. I'm making that up because in the archives, it just says outline of a book proposal. And Rem Edwards gave to me a piece of correspondence that John Carlson, Robert's son and only child, had sent to the Institute in 1984. And in that letter, he said that at the time of his father's death, he was helping him to write a book that was going to be called The Revolution Against War. And Hartman died, to my knowledge, with that book unfinished, unpublished, and unread. Eerily, it's about the same state as the adoption or the lack of adoption of Hartman's ideas about war and peace. They remain unknown and unadopted. So this book, in essence, was an attempt to bring to life what Hartman left undone. And so we've ended the book with the outline of Hartman's book proposal. The chapters aren't there, but a little introduction to each chapter, I think, is a fitting end to this book. And we decided to call it, I say we, in consultation with others, to call it The Revolution Against War, to honor Hartman's intent. I would like to read to everyone now the introduction of the book proposal that Hartman had written for publishers. He writes, "Peace has been sought for thousands of years in vain. The horror of nuclear bombs has been shown in dozens of books, but they've made no impression sufficient for humanity to abjure war. This shows that something more is needed today than mere description and exhortation. Writing about it will not do any more. One has to give himself, heart, mind, and soul to this task of making peace, and one has to do so full time. I have dedicated the last 30 years to this cause, full time, and now I feel the moment has come to step forward and tell my story. Therefore, the book is written as a personal narrative. It is an autobiography, and it is a mirror of the age. It so happens that each of the significant events of the past 50 years has had a significant counterpart in my life. Thus, each chapter of the book begins with an episode of my life, an episode which is connected with and symbolic for the content of the chapter in question. This not only makes the presentation authentic, but is designed to give the reader at the end the feeling that he knows his situation in the world and that he is ready to act. This book has a dedication to you, the reader, who will decide my life or my death." And that's how we end The Revolution Against War.
I mean, it is a phenomenal work. Not only Hartman's writing here, but this way that you've assembled it, Cliff, in its readability, its context, and then, I believe, for me at least, a distinct call to action to begin engaging with this dialogue. So, a couple notes here in the chat. We've just got a question from Ron Laurie. Do we know if Hartman ever dialogued with Buckminster Fuller regarding the World Peace Game?
I don't know. Others might.
Okay, maybe we'll follow up on that. Just a rhetorical question here, for us to be thinking about, as I'm sure people are watching the chat, but just to reiterate it from Eddie Corbel, it amazes me the clarity of thought and what is of real value that comes out of war and crisis, but why do we continue to repeat the evils of our history? And Cliff, I don't know, that might not be rhetorical, because I think Hartman talks about that a bit in this book.
Yeah, and someone famous said, if we don't know history, we're bound to repeat it. And I believe that my biggest worry, and coming to print with this book is that people might think, oh, this is 60 years old. Why read it now? Let's go on to something contemporary. I think it very much has a contemporary message. It's helpful to learn the history, but it's helpful to reflect on what does that mean to us? Because those on this Zoom call right now were more deeply knowledgeable of formal axiology than the average reader is. We can read into these writings a depth of understanding and clarity that the non-associated person's going to have to work to grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. Just looks like just some praise for the session from KT and from Sherry and from Mark Moore. Just a presentation of true beauty, what you've been doing here, Cliff. A note from Nancy Roberts, what we resist persists. Just a good reminder. Again, just a powerful session. Looks like that quote might be from Santayana, that quote I think that you just gave. So,
Okay.
So Cliff, to wrap us up, I mean, you spent considerable time, effort, and just thought deep into much of Hartman's work in the archives, but also really wrestling with this text itself. I mean, as we've talked about, bringing a book like this to fruition, so much goes on behind the scenes that is just, if people knew, they'd never write, they would never read a book the same way. But you spent a long time with this manuscript in particular. What did you learn from his work and this publishing process, and what can we kind of expect moving forward?
Well, I'd say I learned a lot, and most of this a deeper empathic understanding of Hartman. When you type out word for word, letter by letter, hundreds of pages of someone else's work, you really get to know that. And I studied and transcribed probably 60% more than made it into this book. As you might think, there was a lot of repetition and repetitiveness. There's some redundancy built in. I thought we should keep that, but there are some that I left out. I came away from it with a growing realization of how multifaceted Hartman's thought was, how widely applied it was, what a good writer he is. And I'm sorry to those who love the structure of value, but I didn't get the sense that Hartman was a great writer in reading that book and in putting this together. I think he really is. It reminded me that even those of us who've been studying Hartman for many, many years, and I've been doing it for 18 years, how little I know about his thoughts and so forth. And I've said it before, but I would bring it up again, that his willingness to abundantly talk about morals and morality is a gift that we ought to remember.
Yeah, awesome. So we've just got a couple notes in the chat. I just want to make sure we're hitting on them, because it looks like this work and these quotes are resonating really well with a lot of people. So Cliff, just make sure you get to kind of scroll through and back through that. One of the things, just in closing, I would love to share with you guys. So as a sort of a freebie for joining us today, obviously we hope that you'll go and buy the book. I did see a question there, is Amazon the best place to get it? No, go get it from the Institute bookstore. So hartmaninstitute.org/bookstore. Grab it from there. You'll see the hardback version as well as the paperback version and the ebook version. And so please, buy it, read it. Like I said, it's an extremely readable book. I read it in a 6-hour drive. So if I can do it, you can too. So, but as a freebie for joining us today, we would love to share with you Cliff's editor's notes. So what we're going to be doing is following up, and when you get the recording of this session, we'll be following up with a PDF that includes sort of a truncated ebook, if you will, that has Cliff's editor's notes introducing these chapters and a bit of what we've talked about today. And then just a reminder about the publication efforts that the Institute is doing at large, the board. But I know Cliff and I and Susie work really closely to bring these books to life. So some of the things that we're working on, and our generous donors in our membership base are working diligently to bring more of Hartman's work to life from this trip that Cliff did into the archives. And hopefully we can do another one and continue to see more and more of Hartman's work come to life. But so included in this list I'm about to give are 2 books that we hope to publish, fingers crossed, by the end of 2021. So stay involved with us to get notice of when these books are coming out. Books we have coming out are The Wit and Wisdom, Inspiration for Living Life Fully. This is a quote book by Robert S. Hartman. So all these quotes are by Robert S. Hartman, but we have compiled them in a way that gives the breadth of his thinking from theory to application in these really beautiful truncated quotes. I mean, he's nothing if not one of the most quotable authors I've ever interacted with. But so we'll be bringing that book to life hopefully shortly in the next few months. Then we have The Partnership of Capital and Labor, again edited by Cliff with thanks to transcriptions by Bruce Moore and Clay Urey. The Science of Decision Making with Bruce Moore as editor. The Structure of Personality, On God's Side with transcription by Steve Byram. And then the collected writings, his sort of collected writings on spirituality and religion, which may look similar to the structure of The Revolution Against War with transcription by me. But all of this, what we're doing, all these efforts to bring his work to life is really in anticipation of and for the legacy of the 2023 50th anniversary of his death. So in just a few years, it will have been 50 years without us hearing from him and many of the people on the call working with him. So this is really an aim of that legacy and in that celebration. So if you would like to get involved, please reach out to us. But again, just stay in touch with the emails and be buying the books if you can from the hartmaninstitute.com/bookstore. That gives us a bit more to work with in terms of future budgets to bring these books to life. And of course, we take donations.
Well, I'd like to add, even if you buy them from the Institute bookstore, please go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and write a review. Our publishing guide consultant has told us that books that have 5 or more reviews sell twice as many as those who don't. So please, if you like it, go write a review of it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. That will help the cause.
Yeah, that helps tremendously. And I don't know that our bookstore can yet ship internationally. So for our international folks on the call, Amazon may be your best bet for the current time. But on Amazon, you'll notice too, we have an author profile for Hartman set up. So if there are works that we're missing under that author profile, please let us know. But we can also share that with you. And that's a place to reference all of his works and leave reviews for the books you've read, like Freedom to Live and 5 lectures on formal axiology, and of course, The Revolution Against War.
You know, I'd like to say I'm certainly not the spokesman for the original group of people that started with Dr. Hartman. Probably Vera or probably Wayne or probably Dr. Edwards would be much better than me. But I tell you what, you just can't put into words how important what's been done with these books and what Cliff has done and kind of heading the movement of these books into print is. It's just remarkable, and we should all be extremely grateful for that. Freedom to Live and The Structure of Value and The Knowledge of the Good, all those are powerful books that we cut our teeth on. But I think in retrospect, had we been able to cut our teeth on the 5 lectures or these thoughts about war, that suddenly Dr. Hartman would have become so much more accessible. So I really am grateful and not just grateful, thankful for what Cliff has advanced here and the others that have worked with him and where we're going as an institute. I mean, this is what we've dreamed about for, 40 years. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Steve.